Hi, I'm Angela Abraham. I'm the CEO and founder of Descriptionary. And the title of this talk is Our Marvelous Neurology Speaks Through Creative Fiction to Enhance Personal Health and Sustainability. Firstly, a few words from Captain Obvious. And the reason I do this is because there's certain facts we all know, but unless we take the time to sort of unpack them from our brains before we head into this talk, it may not feel so obvious later on as we go through. So, firstly, the brain is a physical organ the same way a heart or kidney is. So, we can remind ourselves that inside our head there is this fatty lump and it is wired like a machine, only with neurons, and so it's a sort of organic computer that we have in our head. The brain has specialized areas that switch in and out of use to provide different functions depending on what inputs it gets from the body and from the environment. So if we're feeling afraid versus if we're feeling loved and safe, we'll be using a different part of the brain. So the brain attempts to regulate its internal and external environment via storytelling to produce the best environment possible, as close to safety and love and sustainability as it can achieve. And this is why we evolved with storytelling. This is why stories are so important to humanity. The story is created by the brain, and thus we can also learn much about how the brain functions from stories. So this is something that a lot of people don't consciously think of, but when we do think of it, it's obvious. The stories are created by our neurology, and so in the stories, as we're going to see as we go through this talk, our neurology is reflected in the story, and the story is trying to create a healthier brain. So first our brains make stories, and then our stories are feeding back to us to make healthier brains. So let's take a little look about why storytelling evolved and why it changes our lives for the better. A little quote here, genocide has been practiced in all of the world and during all periods of history. And the reason why I use that quote is so that we can hopefully get a little bit away from what somebody's personal ethnicity or national background may or may not have done in the past, but to simply accept that we are all descended from genocidal apes and that it's part of our evolutionary history. And that when we look at the functionality of storytelling, it is very much to wake up our more highly evolved brain, our prefrontal cortex, and to bring us to be both empathic, creative problem solvers, and also to use the logical areas of our brain. Essentially, the story is there to help us use and develop the best bits of our brain, and so that we can have a healthy, functioning, non-genocidal community that works together as a group. So when we look at the survival of humans, we can see that we relied upon loving bonds and cooperation. When people talk about survival of the fittest and it being competitive, with humanity, you're really talking about between groups or between tribes. There can obviously be elements of that. But within a tribe or within a group, we very much relied upon the loving bonds and cooperative elements. We'll take a look at another quote here. This one is from Jared Diamond, his book, The World Until Yesterday. A regular feature of the games of hunter-gatherer societies and the smallest farming societies is their lack of competition or contests. It is rare for hunter-gatherer games to keep score or identify a winner. Instead, games of small-scale societies often involve sharing to prepare children for adult life. And in that book, he also describes some observations by a lady called Jane Goodall, who saw some children who were given some bananas, enough for one banana each. And instead of simply taking the bananas and eating them, they played a game with them. And they cut each banana into half, ate one half, and gave the other half to another child. And then that child cut the banana in half, and they gave another half to another child. And they kept that game going for 5 cycles. And so essentially the purpose of the game is to increase their loving bonds, their cooperation, to show each other that they can be trusted rather than to compete. So I think by now we're beginning to get that idea of why storytelling promotes empathy and love, why we need it, because it brings out our more cooperative self. But let's take a look at this quote here. It's from a fantastic book called Born for Love, It's by Maya Salovitz, I've probably not said her name right, and Dr. Bruce Perry. And if you haven't read that book, along with any of the other books I'm mentioning here, if you've got the time, you can get them on Kindle or whatever, and they're all well worth reading. Anyhow, this quote. We are indeed born for love, but at birth we are not yet fully loving. Infants' brains are the most malleable and vulnerable. The gifts of our biology are a potential, not a guarantee. As with many other human potentials present at birth, empathy and love require specific experiences to develop. Also in that book, they talk about facts that such as by the age of 3 years old, 90% of that child's brain developed after they were born. And that if they're in a stressful environment, that not only affects their development of their neurology, but it also affects the expression of over 900 genes, which is mentioned in quite a few books related to this topic, but they also mention that. So our own neurology is growing healthier brains via storytelling. So if we take a look at this quote here from Professor Luis Cosolino, who wrote The Social Neuroscience of Education, brains grow best in the context of supportive relationships, low levels of stress, and through the use of creative stories. So when we are making creative stories, often, if you think about the kind of stories we read to young children, they're loving, they're relaxing, they provide good role models for good parenting, good role models for the parent-child bond, and they support emotionally, and they help us to develop our empathy, our creative thinking, our logical thinking skills, essentially the very best of the human brain, the very best of the most highly evolved functions. And these are the functions we need, of course, for cooperation and a healthy society. So storytelling enhances love and nurture. Now, I included this book here, Guess How Much I Love You, because it's such a sweet book for anyone who's had little kids. If you haven't read that book, you should. It's just the sweetest book. Anyway, so nurturing cues become associated with a decrease in the stress response in the infant. These crucial associations between positive human interactions, reward systems, and the stress response networks are the neurobiological glue for all future healthy relationships. So again, here we can see that there is a direct relationship between storytelling and the development of the human brain and how the story interacts directly with society. And then by extension, we can think about how a functional society treats the natural world compared to a competitive or more hostile society. So we can start to see now the relationship between the story, the human brain, the biology of the human body, but also the natural environment and the natural world. They're all connected in a feedback relationship. So, storytelling promotes stability in human society. Let's look at this quote here. I took it from a paper, a guy called Egan in 1999. If anyone could find the actual paper that's in, then please do send that to me, because I've since then lost the rest of the reference. However, it's a great quote, so I would really want to include it. There is little doubt that the story is a technical tool that has provided a measure of order and stability to human societies for countless millennia. It appears through a review of the literature that the story is one of the most important inventions of humankind. So it's been known for a long time that stories aren't just entertainment, it's a technical tool, it's a technology developed by the organic computer we call the human brain to develop its own internal neurology better. So the writer develops their own internal neurology better by writing the story. By telling the story, they are impacting and developing the neurology of other people to a higher level. And by doing that, it provides order and stability to society, and an order and stable society is able to care for the natural world better. Let's take a look at the world of Marvel, because there are such great examples in the Marvel comic books that show very clearly how it is our neurology that is impacting the neurology of the reader or the audience of the movie. So let's take a look at that. Let's take some lessons from the Incredible Hulk and Bruce Banner. Let's think about what makes Bruce become Hulk. Always, right, when he's afraid, when there's a fear or he needs to protect someone, when he needs to use his more primitive self, he becomes Hulk. And what makes Hulk become Bruce? Well, particularly in the movie version, it's his interaction with Black Widow. When she's showing him love, when she's singing a lullaby, when she calms him, when he feels safe, he starts to become Bruce. So Bruce is, of course, the representation of the higher brain, of the prefrontal cortex, which has our self-control, creative thinking processes, empathy, and logic. When we look at that, we can see that this triggering of the Hulk between fear and love is neurologically accurate. So before this was known in science, this was known already in pop culture, in comic books. And for those of you who want to see a very early model of this, you can take a look at the Cherokee legend of the two wolves. You can just Google that, Cherokee legend of the two wolves, and you'll see that this Bruce Hulk triggering between fear and love is very well explained in that legend. Or whether you want to think about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, then there's lots of examples of this being shown in storytelling and literature. So not only is the story trying to keep everything loving and kind, it's also trying to educate us as to what we need for proper neurological health. And if we think about the difficulty Bruce has in controlling his conversion to the Hulk, that's also accurate. Like when you're triggered by a fearful situation, it is very challenging to re-engage your higher brain, to think logically, to think with empathy, to think cooperatively, which is pretty topical, in the times, that we're entering with the current pandemic. It is difficult to remain in your higher, more evolved brain and to make, competent decisions that are thinking about the entire community. But we all will be better off the more we can be our inner Bruce and less of our inner Hulk. The better off everyone is. Also, we need these role models.